William Colby, does the United States need a CIA in the 1990s?
It certainly does. After World War I, we disbanded our intelligence. We found that we needed it, and we rebuilt it. After World War II, we disbanded our intelligence, and then we found that we need it. Let's not go through that again.
Does the CIA that exists today best serve the intelligence needs of the United States?
I think so, in general. I think obviously it's not perfect, and there are always improvements that are possible, without any question. But nonetheless, I think the basic structure is well set and is well established, and you have a highly professional core of experts in intelligence, and they should not be disbanded.
What does it take to direct the CIA?
A sense of management, a sense of understanding of the world, where it's going, what problems are in the world, and so forth. I think, as I told one of my predecessors, the most important thing you can do is learn the substance of what's happening. Let the management be run by somebody else. You get a hold of the substance, because if you're all alone in the cabinet room someday giving advice on some screaming crisis, you're not going to be able to depend upon the experts underneath you. You're going to have it yourself. You're going to have to read it into yourself over the years. You
led the CIA during what years?
1973 to 76.
You came to that job. You came from a career...
I was a career officer, yes.
With a career position. The current nominee, Robert Gates, also career position. Is it an advantage to be an insider?
There are certain advantages and certain disadvantages. You obviously have associations which you grew up with, which sometimes you wish weren't perhaps so close. You also have a familiarity with a piece of the agency and not an equal familiarity with some of the other aspects. But you can learn that. But on the other hand, you do know something about what intelligence is all about. The interesting thing about the Gates nomination is that for the very first time, you have an analyst being named to head the agency. Now, that was the basic concept of central intelligence, to establish a center to which all the information would flow to be examined by analysts who could tell you what it really meant, to look at the underlying forces at work, the predictions for the future, and so forth. And yet, over the years, it was the operators who essentially ran the agency: Dulles, Helms, Colby, Casey. And finally, we now have the analyst being named. And I think it's a very significant moment of vindication for the concept of central intelligence.
Within the agency, is there a bit of competition between the operators and the analysts?
Oh, sure, always. You know, it's like the Army and the Navy and all that. They'll collaborate, but they also compete a bit.
Does it matter at all that the president is the former director of the CIA?
I don't think so, except that he understands it, obviously. He's gone into depth in understanding all the elements of it. He did a splendid job as director. There's no question about it. He was highly regarded in the agency for his service there. So it's convenient that he is there, because you don't have to explain things to him. He knows right away what it's all about, and he knows the problems, he knows what's possible, and he knows what's not possible.
Could you speculate as to whether or not he relies in a different manner upon the CIA director because he held the position?
I couldn't speculate on that. I just don't know. I'm sure that he is very busy being president as a whole and isn't looking to try to run the agency in any detail, that's for sure.
Are you taking a public position on the Gates nomination?
I've supported the nomination of Mr. Gates. I think he's a very good man. He's for this analytical background, for one thing. And he's very well experienced. He's been in high posts in our national security concept, both in the agency and in the National Security Council. So he knows how the machinery works at that level, and he can fit into it very well. He also knows the agency, having been both an analyst there and deputy director, so that he knows how the agency works and how to get the best out of it. So I think he's an ideal nominee.
His nomination comes right at the time of all the changes in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
What do those changes mean for the job?
Well, it'll mean, I think, for the next several years, a great deal of interest in the Soviet Union. Less, perhaps, interest in whether their forces are going to burst out of the Fulda Gap onto Western Europe. No, that's not going to happen. But what is going on? What are the political developments, the economic, the social, psychological, all of these, the ethnic problems, the structural problems of holding a union of republics together, all of these kinds of difficulties. It's going to be a matter not of secret information. Mr. Yeltsin, Mr. Gorbachev don't have a secret plan. They're working their way through the problem. So again, it's the analyst who's the best one to assemble all this information and on its own background of knowledge of the area, knowledge of the people, of the society, and so forth, make judgments about where it's apt to go, and consequently what we ought to do to make sure that we do the right thing and that the outcome is better rather than worse.
Some people argue that our intelligence needs for the future will be more like the situations with regard to Iraq last year.
Well, we'll certainly have those. I mean, we will continually have the problems of terrorism, the drug lords, those countries who would secretly try to build up nuclear forces, things of this nature. You're going to have counterintelligence problems to keep our technology from being stolen by our economic competitors and things of that nature. Sure, all of that's going to be there, but there's still going to be a great deal of interest in the developments of the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. And this is really one of the real changes that could happen for the good or the bad. If the Soviet Union develops well, we might well see a rich, happy Soviet Union on the order of Germany and Japan now, 40 years after World War II, in another 10 to 20 years. Or, if it goes badly, we might have all sorts of misery come out of that. And I think knowledge of the problems and who the people are and all the rest of it, it will be important to help us make the decisions to help the process go in the right direction.
Is there a large enough staff and budget to manage both? It's really not both. There are many elements to the equation.
Oh, I think the budget will go down and the staff may go down a bit because, after all, there isn't the need for constant surveillance of every flicker of the Soviet military forces. You can periodically make sure that those tanks really are well beyond the Urals, that the forces are no bigger than they are alleged to be, that they're not crowding up onto the Polish border and ready to burst forth eastwards and so forth. But you can do that periodically, and you don't have to do it every moment, so that there's a considerable saving in really the most expensive aspect of modern intelligence, which is the high technology.
With all the technology, why do you need people?
Because some things the technology can't tell you. Technology will tell you what's there, but it can't tell you where people are going, what people are thinking, what the tensions, the political tensions, the economic pressures, things of that nature, the policy alternatives that the leaders there are considering. All these are things that only an agent or in some case the media can tell you. And you have to examine the media, you have to look at everything. After all, if something comes over the top of the table, it's a lot easier getting it than if you have to go under the table to get it. So glasnost is a net plus, very distinctly, although the analytical problems are very complicated. When Stalinism was one big monolith, if you get one spy into one corner of it and saw a little look in there, you could pretty well rely on the fact that what you saw was representative of what was happening elsewhere because of the monolithic quality. Today, there isn't any monolith. All the forces are out there in the open, struggling and wrestling and writing and talking and all the rest of it. And the question is, how do you gather all that material, make it sensible, and get some kind of conclusion out of it? It's a major chore. It's a different chore, but it's a major chore. You will still need the people to do that.
One reads from time to time that there are morale problems within the staff of the CIA.
Oh, that's always, you have any organization has some morale problems from day to day, of course. Right at the moment, I think the problem is that this move by the special prosecutor against junior CIA, middle-level CIA officers, I think is outrageous. I mean, here that whole prosecution started to aim at a major misfeasance of action by the president and maybe the director of CIA at the time, maybe Ollie North and Admiral Poindexter. Well, the president's immune, Casey's dead. You've got very weak indictments and convictions against North and Poindexter, which look like they're going to be turned over on appeal. And so what are we doing? We're going after some middle-level CIA officers, not for what they did, but for what they didn't say, following their sense of loyalty that if their boss told them to stay out of this, they stayed out. The basic ethos of intelligence, if you will, is that if you need to know something, you know about it. If you don't need to know about it, you mind your own business in order to respect the secrecy and the compartmentation. So it's clear that Casey was giving the signals, you guys stay out of this, because Congress has prohibited the agency from getting into it, so stay out of it, and they stayed out. And when they ran into a flicker or two of information about it, they pushed it away. And they thought they were doing the right thing.
You question the timing of the indictment?
Oh, I think, as I say, I think the main issue was at the policy level, not down at the level of some officer who happened to learn something and then didn't say it. I mean, one of the laws under which they're being prosecuted is the one that says if you don't help Congress to know what all it wants to know, well, you couldn't have an appropriations hearing in this country if you applied that kind of a law to every witness before the Appropriations Committee, because everybody goes up and makes his pitch for what he believes and what he thinks. And he doesn't bring all the negatives up there. Those come out in the process of the debate and all the rest. But nobody ever thought of prosecuting the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of Agriculture for giving a partial approach to his request for appropriations.
What responsibilities does Congress have with regard to oversight of intelligence?
The same that it has with respect to the Army, the Navy, the Foreign Service, the Agriculture Department. We have a separation of powers. Now, the difference is that those agencies are the oversight is conducted publicly. And, you have a generally open approach to it. But you can't do that with intelligence because you need to respect the secrets. And so you have special committees set up by the House and by the Senate to supervise the CIA and the other intelligence agencies. And they do their supervision in secrecy. But they're entitled to know the secrets, those members, and they're expected to keep the secrets, and by and large I think they have. The comment is that Congress hasn't leaked any more than the executive, which isn't saying much, but nonetheless the fact is that Congress does determine what the budget should be, what the size of the organization should be. They review the programs and the policies and so forth and indicate if they don't agree with them. They tell the government that they don't agree with them. They put in a resolution which says stop them. And they stop, as they did with Angola for a while, and then they repealed that, and as they did with Nicaragua.
When you look at the relationship right now between Congress and the CIA, how would you assess it?
As my impression is, they're pretty good. That the committees do feel that they're getting a fair shake, that they're not told every little detail, but that's not true in the Army either. But that nonetheless, that they can find out what they want to know, that they can exert their responsibilities effectively for supervision of the agency.
Confirmation hearings this coming week are in full glare of public scrutiny.
Sure.
Comment on that, if you would.
Well, it's part of the Constitution. It says certain officers have to be confirmed by the Senate. And I've gone through that process, and they ask you a lot of questions about your background, and you have opponents come up and testify against you, and I had that, and then you have a chance perhaps to answer the allegations made, and you get questioned. You make commitments as to how that you will adhere to the law, that you will stay in good relationship with Congress and so forth. And those commitments are binding on you when you go into your office. So it's the process that applies to all the rest of the government, and it also applies to the 2 senior posts of CIA.
Will Mr. Gates be confirmed?
I think he will, unless something really startling comes up that I haven't seen anything much about. I think the real question is how qualified is he to run the agency, and I think he's very well qualified to run the agency. He's had a broad experience in national security and the agency and all the rest of it, and he's a natural for it.
On the management side, I have seen the overall intelligence dollars for this country at about $30 billion. Does CIA get a large portion of that pie?
I don't know the figure these days. I'm out of office so long that I really don't know the figure. I've seen that same figure, but it's referring to the entire intelligence community, so-called, the Army, the Navy, the tactical intelligence, all the way down to the S2 in a Marine battalion, that sort of thing, all of that kind of intelligence work. So the answer, no, the CIA gets a fairly small proportion of that total. I don't know what it is, but you pay for the satellites, you pay for the aircraft, you pay for the big listening devices all over the world. That's where the big money is.
How does the CIA interrelate with all of those various agencies who have intelligence gathering?
Very well. Most of the information flows electrically, and it goes to all the different members if they're involved in it. The China expert in CIA will get the material from the NSA and from the Navy and all the rest of it, as well as what he gets from the State Department and reads the press, and what he gets from all the other, and the CIA operations themselves. So the information flows very freely. The heads of the agencies, the various agencies, sit with the Director of Central Intelligence, and they go over their programs and they decide whether they need a new satellite or they don't. But you don't have the Army putting up one satellite and the Navy another one and the CIA one. You put up one satellite and it serves all of them. And you coordinate the activities in that fashion.
You're painting a picture of things working pretty well.
Pretty well.
This week, in preparation for the hearings, there are lots of news articles will be coming out.
Sure.
A lot of op-ed pieces with criticisms of the process,
Sure.
saying that it's duplicative, redundant.
Sure.
What's
Well, you can always make those complaints, but fact is that, yes, there is a certain duplication. The DIA gathers a lot of information about the enemy forces, about foreign forces, and so does the CIA. But is that duplication? Not really. Some of it is, to a degree. But you leave the details of it to the military services, and then you get the conclusions. And then you look it over to see whether you really agree with it or not. And maybe you don't. Maybe the Navy sees the enemy fleets as much more threatening than they really are. And so you have an independent judgment by the CIA. No, I know that there are those numbers, but are they really that threatening? I discovered one time that the Soviet fleet in the Mediterranean spent 85% of its time at anchor. Well, suddenly I realized that the Soviet fleet in the Mediterranean was no threat to anybody. You can't have an effective fleet if it's spending its time at anchor. You need the kind we have, which if it's at sea, it works. And it becomes really operationally very effective. And I came to the conclusion that the Soviet surface fleet was really not much of a problem for our Navy, as distinct from the submarines, which were. But the kind of independent judgment you can make, but the Navy might at that time, I don't recall that they did this, but they might be just counting the ships, saying, you know, there are an awful lot of ships there, and scare you to death with the number of ships. So you need more ships to meet those ships, but if they're only 15% efficient, they're not that dangerous. And it's that kind of judgmental difference that you will get, which is not duplication. It's a check on each other's judgments.
You mentioned a little bit.
And I'm not saying that sometimes the CIA isn't wrong, too, and that the services have been right on a few things. There's no question about that.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that there were other kinds of responsibilities these days in intelligence gathering. Spend a little bit more time on drugs, if you would.
Well, the drug problem is complicated because you're talking about legal violations and you want to prosecute people. And you've got to be very careful about their constitutional rights of some accused. And so you can't use the normal intelligence operations, espionage and so forth, against a drug person that you want to arrest and bring to judgment. That's a job you leave to the law enforcement agencies, the DEA, the FBI, whatever. You can find it, you can get information, and you can pass it over to them. But when it gets the detailed follow-up for law enforcement, you leave it to those law enforcement agencies. But nonetheless, you can collect a lot of information about the areas from which the stuff comes, the traffickers, the communications techniques, and all the rest of it. There are things you can contribute to a joint effort against those kinds of people.
Does the CIA ever have any purview within the borders of the United States?
Not really. No, it obviously has a headquarters here, and it openly does inquire of friendly Americans. They will share some information that they know about the rest of the world. They go and call on businesses that do businesses and so forth to the extent that that person is willing to share some information with his government about what he may know about the rest of the world. So in that sense, you do a little thing, but not much.
You also cited terrorism.
Well, that's particularly, I mean, there's something that the satellite won't help you very much on. That's the something you need the agent to get in there, and you're not going to send James Bond to join a terrorist group in Beirut. You've got to get your case officer has to develop a whole series of intermediaries, and then down at the end of that trail, you get the man who's part of the terrorist group, and he will tell A, and A will tell B, and B will tell C, and C will tell D, and finally you get it. And by that time it's late, and it's lost some of its precision, but it's the only way you get it. And you are able to build up information banks about who these people are, what their aliases are, what their backgrounds, what their alliances with different groups are, so that you know what your enemy is. That's the first stage toward combating these kind of people, is to know who they are, why do they do it, what are their plans, what are their training, what assistance do they get from other countries, that sort of thing. We're finding out some fascinating things out of the East German and other Eastern European intelligence services of the help they were giving to terrorists in the days of the Cold War. Now, we knew that was happening. We knew that the East Germans were involved in helping train and help some of these terrorist groups.
One of the other things you and I were looking at this front page article before we started our interview here, which suggests with regard to East Germany that the files are now beginning to reveal that there were a number of what's commonly called double agents.
I'm sure there were some. I mean, there's no question about it. I have no idea how many. The East German service was a very effective service. There's no question about it. They had some spectacularly successful operations into Western Germany, secretary to the prime minister or chancellor and so forth. That's pretty good work, you have to say. And they were very serious about their work, and I'm sure they had double agents, some of the people that we thought we had that they were also using. I think, though, that for a long time we were absolutely stopped in our efforts to get Soviet agents for fear that they would be doubled. And I always took the line that, well, if I can get 5 good agents, I'll take 5 bad ones, just so I get 5 good ones. What I don't want is to have none so that I won't have any bad ones. That I think is counterproductive. And we've gotten that situation for a while, unfortunately.
That you had none?
We had none because we were so afraid of getting a bad one that we weren't getting any.
The other area that you mentioned was economic intelligence gathering.
Mm-hmm.
That would seem by its nature to be gathering intelligence on people who are friendly.
Well, but let's talk about what intelligence, how much intelligence needs to be gathered secretly, as distinct from how much information can you get just by looking at it. You don't need a satellite photograph to count Toyotas, but you may be very interested in how many Toyotas there are and how many being sold and where and shipped and all that sort of thing. But that information is totally available. But then you want to make some analysis about what does this mean, about where the markets are going to develop, what does it mean to the competitive problems that our country has, and that sort of thing. So you don't need to seek that information secretly. In fact, it's my contention that for economic purposes, you don't want to seek it secretly because you're taking a risk. And when you conduct a secret operation, it seems to me there are 3 basic questions that you have to answer. One, how important is it that you get it secretly? Because if you can get it openly, you're silly to get it secretly. Secondly, what are the risks of being caught, which is a professional question, which you then work to minimize. And then the third question is the most important one of all. If you get caught, either before or after success or failure, what is the impact? And for that reason, I say it would be a vast mistake for us to get into economic espionage with the other competing friends of ours around the world. The impact, the adverse impact, would be far beyond the value we would get out of it.
When you were talking about the structure of information sharing, what about strategic planning for the long term that transcends the life of one administration? How does that go on?
Well, strategic planning, of course, is not really an intelligence function. It's conducted by the State Department and the Defense Department. It's a policy question. But obviously, if you're going to have to look ahead for several years, if you're talking about building a fleet. Now, how big a fleet are we going to have at the year 2000? You've got to make that decision just about now, because it's going to take you that long to produce the replacements for the current ships and all the rest of it. So you project ahead as well as you can, and then you make a judgment about what kinds of things you think you'll need. And then a new administration will come in and they will take another look at it. Maybe they'll disagree with the previous administration, that no, they've over-exaggerated the problem. Or the world will change, as it certainly has changed the last year and a half. I mean, the spectacular changes that we've faced mean major changes in our strategic planning. The administration is planning on a 1/4 cut in our armed forces. I don't think that's enough, but at least they realize that they've got to plan for a reduced military, and I think that that makes sense, that they plan in that direction. I would go further. I would want to move us very fast into an elimination, if possible, of the whole nuclear dimension. Because if you don't have superpowers, there's really no justifying having nuclear. I'm not sure there's much justification anyway, but the fact is that we had this Cold War and we built these huge arsenals which threaten life itself on Earth. And we ought to take, in my mind, as one of our first priorities, getting rid of those things. Because if the great powers will get rid of theirs, then I think we'll have a basis to go to some of these other countries and say, look, don't you build them. Because if you do, we will take action against you and make sure that they don't build them. And you can eliminate that whole weapon systems from the world.
So to understand what you're saying then, it's the strategic planning that drives the intelligence needs, not the other way around.
It's symbiotic. I mean, they both work on each other. Obviously, the intelligence tells you something, and then you plan against that possibility. But also, if you are thinking of where you need to go, you need to get the information base to give you and make a wise decision about it in the future. It's both sides help each other.
In the last few minutes that we have with you, look back in the years that have ensued since your tenure. What are the most significant laws Congress has passed that's changed the nature of intelligence gathering?
Well, I think the one was the setting up of the committees in the Congress for Congress to take an active role in the supervision of intelligence. I think the Congress also passed a very significant law to protect the identities of our officers and agents around the world, which were very badly protected beforehand. Congress also passed a law which allows us to prosecute somebody who claims that he was working for CIA. Previously, if he made that claim, what he then said, and I want to see all the CIA files to show that what I'm doing was right, proper. Now a judge is allowed to look at that request and say, is that really relevant to his defense? And if it is, then it's up to the government either to make the material available or to abandon the case, as was done in the Fernandez case recently. But if the judge decides that this is just puffery by the accused trying to get the benefit of claiming to work for CIA, he can say, no, that's not relevant. And that you don't have to give those files. You go ahead with the files that you have to give, but you can conduct the prosecution. And that's happened in a number of cases that they've just rejected that kind of false defense. So that was a very important law as far as CIA was concerned. There are other rules, the various rules about thou shalt not engage in operations in Nicaragua, which is the whole Iran-Contra problem. Other than that, there are very few laws that apply in very specific terms. They leave it more to the committees on a day-to-day review of what's going on.
Have there also been laws passed that protect individual Americans with regard to intelligence
They're
gathering?
protected under the Constitution, and that's just a matter of getting the agency to comply with it. And by and large, it does. There's no question about it. The investigations in the mid-'70s when I was there showed that there were a few cases over the previous 25 years which we had gone beyond where we should have been. No question about it. Done things we should not have done. I thought there were few and far between for an agency sent out to do the country's duty without any controls whatsoever, but nonetheless they were there. And when I learned about them first, I issued a lot of internal directives saying that will stop. No more wiretapping, no more following people around, no more opening of mail or things of this nature unless there's a legitimate basis, a legal constitutional way of doing it, which there is under a warrant in certain situations. But so I don't think that exists anymore, but there's a great hue and cry about it. But that's just a matter of applying the constitutional defenses, protections of our people. And the interesting aspect is on bugging, for instance. Normally you would think that the agency could bug a telephone in a foreign country without any problem under our law. And yet we have a specific law that says that if the agency wants to bug a telephone in a foreign country of an American citizen living there, it has to get a warrant from a special court we have to do that. In other words, we've applied the constitutional protections of our citizens even when they leave this country against our own country. They're not protected against what another country might do, of course.
While you're mentioning international, what do you believe is the evaluation of the CIA by the intelligence communities in other Western countries?
Oh, I think it's very, very highly respected. I think the KGB had a great concern about it. They spent a lot of their time worrying about it. I think our technology is considered fantastic by anyone who sees it. The foreign countries that we share a certain amount of the information from time to time. It's very highly regarded. With respect to our operations people, they know we make mistakes, and we're Americans, you know, but the Americans are sort of both admired and sometimes sort of joked about. It's just like our American military. It's highly respected, and particularly after the Gulf War. It's enormously respected. There are lots of general staffs around the world who have looked at the American performance in the Gulf and say, whoop, I don't want to tie into those Americans. And I think that's a very good lesson for a lot of people.
In closing, as people are beginning to watch the confirmation hearings this coming week, what do you believe, you don't focus on the CIA regularly, what are the most important questions people should be asking as they watch the process?
Well, I think they'll be asking a lot of questions about who said what to whom about Iran-Contra, which is, in my mind, almost the least important question. The really important question are, what are Bob Gates's qualifications for the job? What's his background? Does he have any imperfections in his performance over the years as an analyst, as a leader of in national security and of the agency? What are his ideas for the future? Where is he going to take the agency? What does he see as the major problems the agency faces? What commitments should the congressmen, the senators get out of him to ensure that they will have a full role of oversight and control of what the agency does? Those are the main issues. The chasing around about who said what to whom 10 years ago, I really think is sort of minor.
William Colby, who led the CIA from 1973 to January of '76. Thank you for talking with C-SPAN.
Thank you.